When I saw my husband standing by the window, his face half hidden by the curtain, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of discovery. It was the way he looked, as if the evening light had revealed something to him that I had been trying, desperately, to hide. He didn't say a word, didn't move, but his eyes followed every sound, every faint movement in the garden. That silence wrapped around me tighter than any accusation. My breath caught, and my fingers clenched the edge of the counter in the kitchen, the cool granite grounding me, though it felt like the ground itself might give way beneath my feet. I thought of that night weeks ago, the night when everything shifted, the night that split my life into before and after. I thought of the dripping tap, the broken faucet I kept meaning to call someone about, and how a simple offer to fix it had become the first thread of a web I hadn't realized I was weaving. He stood there longer than he should have, his stillness pressing into me, and I wondered if he already knew, or if he only felt it in the way the air in our house had changed. My husband had always been a man of few words, but that night his silence was almost unbearable. And before I tell you how it all began, before I unravel the chain of small, ordinary choices that led to that moment by the window, tell me, have you ever felt the weight of a secret pressing so hard against your chest that even the quietest glance felt like exposure? Have you ever told yourself that you could keep control only to watch it slip, thread by thread, until there was no control left? It started quietly. So quietly that, at first, I told myself I was imagining it. There are moments in life that look unremarkable on the surface, an ordinary evening, an unremarkable greeting, a familiar face returning, but if you freeze them in memory, you can see the shift. That first evening when he came back, suitcase in hand, I felt it. I hadn't seen my stepson for years. He had been gone long enough that the edges of his presence had faded from the house, the walls no longer remembered his footsteps, the rooms no longer carried his voice. And yet, when he walked through the door, it was as if the air changed. He didn't even say much, a polite hello, a small smile, but there was something different about him now. Not the boy I remembered, not the teenager who once left in a hurry to find his place in the world. There was a weight to him, a self-possession that wasn't there before. My husband greeted him with the same polite distance he used for nearly everyone. He clapped a hand on his shoulder, asked about the drive, and within minutes returned to his phone, his emails, his quiet rituals. It wasn't hostility, it was just who he was. He loved in a restrained way, in gestures of responsibility rather than warmth. It had been enough for me for a long time. At least, that's what I told myself. But that night, as I set the table, I caught myself watching the way my stepson placed his suitcase by the stairs, the way he looked around as if measuring how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. He smiled at me, a small, casual smile, and it felt like the house itself breathed in for the first time in years. Dinner was polite, almost formal. My husband asked a few questions about his work, his plans. He nodded at the answers without looking up much, his mind already drifting to the office calls he had to make later. I found myself filling in the gaps, asking about details that didn't matter, just to hear the sound of another voice in the room. It was only later that I noticed the faucet. It had been dripping for weeks. A sharp tap of water every few seconds, echoing in the tiled bathroom. My husband had promised, more than once, to call someone to fix it. He never did. Life got in the way, or maybe he just didn't think it was important. When my stepson noticed, he said, almost offhandedly, "I can fix that, you know." I told him he didn't have to, but he shrugged, already looking for tools. "It's no trouble," he said, and that was it. A broken faucet, an offer to help, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But when I thought about it later, lying awake in the dark, it felt like a spark. Because here's the truth I hadn't been willing to name, my marriage wasn't broken. It wasn't cruel or cold in a way that could be explained easily. It was functional. Comfortable. Predictable. And yet, in that comfort, something essential had quietly starved. We no longer reached for each other in the dark. We no longer laughed for no reason. There were touches, brief, dutiful, but rarely warmth. He was a good man. A steady man. And I told myself, for years, that steady was enough. But when my stepson stood in the doorway of the bathroom that evening, tools in hand, saying, "Show me where it's leaking," I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not desire. Not yet. Something smaller, subtler. A flicker of being seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house, my husband's steady breathing beside me, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the faint drip from the faucet that still hadn't been fixed. I thought of him downstairs, unpacking, settling in. I thought of how his voice sounded when he said he'd take care of the faucet, the casual confidence in it. It wasn't that anything had happened. Nothing had. And yet, in that nothing, a door had opened. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that I was overthinking a simple kindness. That it was nothing more than a practical gesture. But I felt the hum of it under my skin, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I wanted that feeling to go away. In the morning, the faucet was still dripping. The tools were still on the counter. And I found myself waiting, not for the leak to be fixed, but for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. The sound of the dripping faucet had become part of the house, a steady reminder of things left undone, of promises to fix small problems that had quietly accumulated over the years. That morning, I heard him downstairs before I even saw him, the scrape of a chair across the kitchen floor, the cupboard door opening, the faint sound of tools being moved. It was strange how quickly his presence had settled into the rhythm of the house, as though he'd never been away. When I walked into the kitchen, he was leaning over the table, sorting through an old toolbox my husband kept but rarely used. The sunlight was coming in at an angle, hitting the side of his face, and for a moment I just stood there, watching, feeling that same unfamiliar flutter from the night before. He looked up, gave me a small nod, and said, almost casually, "I found the wrench. I'll get that faucet fixed today." I nodded back, as if this were the most ordinary exchange in the world, but inside, I felt something catch. I told myself it was nothing, just gratitude for a small kindness, for someone finally dealing with the endless drip that had been driving me quietly mad. And yet, the way he spoke, the way his words carried an ease I hadn't felt in this house for a long time, made me feel seen in a way I couldn't quite explain. Later, when he carried the toolbox upstairs, I followed him, more out of habit than intention. The bathroom felt even smaller that morning, as though the walls had moved closer, the tiles trapping the sound of every breath. He bent down by the sink, twisting the faucet to test it, water splashing lightly against the porcelain. I stood by the door, unsure of what to do with my hands, my voice, myself. The air felt thick with something I didn't want to name. He asked me to hand him a towel, and when I did, our fingers brushed, just lightly, an accidental touch, but enough to make me acutely aware of how close we were in that narrow space. The towel slipped from my hand and fell onto the floor, a clumsy little moment that made us both laugh, too quickly, too softly. I bent to pick it up, and when I straightened, we were closer than before, standing face to face. For a second, I thought I should step back, but I didn't. Neither did he. And then it happened, we kissed. It was brief, almost hesitant, as if neither of us fully understood what we were doing until it was already done. The sound of water dripping filled the silence between us, louder now, somehow. We pulled back almost immediately, the air around us feeling sharp, almost brittle. Neither of us spoke. There were no apologies, no explanations, just that fragile quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it could shatter at any second. He turned back to the faucet, as if the work could undo what had just happened. I stood there for a moment longer, then stepped back into the hallway, my hands trembling slightly even though I tried to keep my face calm. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy blur. Every movement felt deliberate, every sound louder than usual. The clatter of dishes at lunch, the scrape of a chair at dinner, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background. My husband didn't notice, or at least he didn't say anything. He sat at the table, reading emails on his phone, unaware, or unwilling to be aware, of the shift that had already happened in the house. I watched my stepson from across the table, unable to read his expression. He was calm, composed, almost too composed, as if nothing had happened at all. But every so often, his eyes would flicker to mine for the briefest moment, and I felt that same catch in my chest. That night, as I washed the dishes, I kept thinking about the bathroom, the sound of dripping water, the narrow space, the way we had been standing too close. I told myself it had been a mistake, that it meant nothing. But I couldn't shake the memory of how it had felt. Later, lying in bed, I turned on my side and looked at my husband, his face calm in sleep, the same as it had been for years. I felt the familiar guilt settle in, heavy, sharp, but layered under it was something else, something I didn't want to look at too closely. Because deep down, I knew the kiss wasn't just an accident. It was the crack in the surface, the first sign of something breaking open, whether I wanted it to or not. I told myself to forget it. To pretend it hadn't happened. But in the dark, with the house quiet and the faucet still dripping faintly down the hall, I knew I wouldn't. Dinner that evening felt wrong, though nothing outwardly was different. The table was set the same way it always had been, the same dishes, the same soft hum of the kitchen light, the same muted clink of forks and knives against plates. My husband sat at his usual place, phone face down beside him, as if that gesture alone meant he was present, even when his mind was somewhere else. Across from me, my stepson ate quietly, too quietly, and every time I dared glance up, his eyes were already elsewhere, fixed on nothing in particular. I tried to tell myself that what had happened in the bathroom earlier had been small enough to fade into nothing. Just an impulsive mistake, like brushing against someone in a crowded room. But the air around us said otherwise. It wasn't what we said, it was what we didn't. The silence was almost unbearable, and yet it was the kind of silence no one wanted to break. My husband mentioned something about a client calling late tomorrow. I nodded at the right times, my responses automatic. I could feel my stepson's gaze flicker toward me just once, only for a second, and that was enough to send a sharp twist through my chest. When dinner ended, my husband stood, cleared his plate, and left it by the sink. He kissed my cheek the way he always did, a light brush, polite, almost practiced, and went to his study, the door clicking softly behind him. I stayed behind to wash the dishes. My stepson carried his plate to the counter and paused, as if deciding whether to say something. He didn't. He just left it there, murmured a quiet thanks for dinner, and disappeared up the stairs. The kitchen felt colder after that. I stood at the sink, scrubbing a plate that didn't need scrubbing, staring at the water as it swirled down the drain. I told myself the unease would pass, that a single kiss couldn't possibly unmake the life I had built over decades. But even as I thought it, I knew that was a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. The room felt too still, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My mind replayed the moment in the bathroom over and over, the way his hand brushed mine, the pause before it happened, the way we had both stepped back too quickly afterward. I tried to shut it out, but every small sound in the house reminded me. The creak of a floorboard in the hallway. The faintest click of a door closing somewhere upstairs. The slow drip of that same faucet, still not fixed, echoing like a metronome through the dark. At one point, I heard footsteps, soft, careful, on the stairs. My chest tightened. They weren't hurried, weren't sneaky, just the sound of someone moving through the house at night. Maybe to the kitchen for water, maybe just restless. But each step seemed louder than the one before. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to sleep, even though my eyes were open. My husband shifted once, rolling onto his side, and I thought irrationally that he, too, was awake, listening. Minutes stretched, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. At some point, I heard the faucet run, just for a second, like he'd tested it. Then quiet again. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The day unfolded in fragments. My husband left early for a meeting, his briefcase in one hand, his travel mug in the other. He kissed my cheek again, the same brief gesture, and said he'd be back late. I watched him drive away and felt, for the first time, an almost painful sense of distance, not from his absence, but from the fact that his presence lately didn't feel all that different from his absence. I found my stepson in the garage later, searching for something. He was leaning over the workbench, tools scattered around him, the smell of oil sharp in the air. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, neither of us said anything. The memory of the kiss sat between us like a fragile, invisible line. I finally broke the silence with something ordinary, almost absurdly ordinary. Did you find what you needed? He nodded, said something about the wrench he still couldn't locate. The conversation moved around the edges of what we weren't talking about. There was no mention of the bathroom, no mention of the moment we'd shared. But every pause, every glance held the weight of it. Later, back inside, I tried to settle into the usual rhythm of the day. Laundry, phone calls, emails. But nothing felt usual anymore. The simplest tasks felt like acting in a play I hadn't rehearsed enough for. I knew my lines, but they didn't sound like me anymore. That night, the silence at dinner was louder. The clatter of silverware felt jarring, the scrape of chairs on the tile sharper than usual. My husband didn't notice, or maybe he noticed everything and chose not to speak. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling again, the same ceiling I had stared at for years, and for the first time I wondered what I was waiting for, and what, exactly, I was afraid of. The garage always smelled the same oil, dust, and the faint metallic tang of tools that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't a space I went into often. My husband kept it orderly enough, but he rarely worked there himself. It was more of a storage room than a workshop. That morning, though, I noticed the door slightly ajar, the light spilling onto the driveway in a thin, pale strip. Inside, my stepson was crouched near the old workbench, sleeves rolled up, a few tools scattered around him in no particular order. He was wiping his hands on a rag, brow furrowed in quiet focus. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping in, not sure why I hesitated. Looking for something? The words left my mouth before I thought them through, and the way they sounded, too casual, too familiar, made me almost regret speaking. He glanced up, nodded once, and said he was trying to find the right wrench for the faucet. His voice was calm, practical, like it had been every time he mentioned fixing something, and yet there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. The garage felt colder than the rest of the house, even though the morning sun had already warmed the driveway. I leaned lightly against the doorframe, trying not to look like I was doing anything but passing by. I told myself I should leave, let him work, not linger. But I didn't move. The silence between us wasn't sharp like it had been at dinner the night before. It was softer, but heavier, as if both of us were aware of the thing neither of us dared name. I watched as he bent down to pick up a tool, the muscles in his arm flexing briefly, and I felt that flicker again, that strange mix of curiosity and unease that had been following me since the bathroom. He broke the silence first, not by mentioning the kiss, not by bringing up anything dangerous, but with a question that felt both innocent and loaded. "Do you ever miss it?" I blinked. "Miss what?" "Something different," he said, not looking at me as he spoke, his hands still busy with the tools. "A different life. Something else." The words landed harder than they should have. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I could have given a dozen safe answers. No, of course not, I'm happy, everything is fine. But they all felt false in my throat. Instead, I let the silence stretch, and maybe that was an answer in itself. He looked up then, just briefly, his expression unreadable. There wasn't a smile, but there wasn't judgment either, just a quiet awareness. The shrill ring of my phone in my pocket made me jump. I fumbled for it, my husband's name glowing on the screen. I answered, forcing brightness into my voice. He asked if I could email him a document he'd left at home. He mentioned his meeting, his schedule, his return time. His voice was steady, professional, the same tone he used with everyone, including me. When I hung up, the garage felt quieter than before, the conversation we'd been having broken but not gone. My stepson turned back to the workbench, and I felt like I should leave. This time, I did. The rest of the day I moved through the house like I was carrying something fragile I couldn't put down. I folded laundry, I made lunch, I checked emails, the motions of an ordinary day, but the question he'd asked kept circling in my mind. Do you ever miss it? That evening, dinner was another silent performance. My husband came home late, loosened his tie at the table, and spoke about a client in another state. I listened, nodding where I should, my hands folded in my lap. Across the table, my stepson ate quietly, his eyes rarely meeting mine, but when they did, just for the briefest second, it felt like the entire house tilted. Later, when I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, I caught sight of the garage light through the window. It was still on. I wondered if he was in there again, or if he'd forgotten to turn it off. I stood there for a long time, staring out at that faint glow, thinking of the question he'd asked, and realizing that my answer, the one I hadn't spoken, was more complicated than I wanted it to be. Because the truth was, I did miss something. I didn't even know what to call it exactly: youth, excitement, possibility. Something that had once lived inside me and had been quietly buried under years of routine. I told myself that wasn't dangerous. That missing something wasn't the same as acting on it. But I also knew, as I turned off the kitchen light and walked up the stairs, that the garage, that cold, dusty space that had never meant anything before, had already become a place I wouldn't forget. The idea of leaving the house that day felt like escape, even though I never would have called it that out loud. It started with a small suggestion, one that sounded harmless enough when I said it at breakfast. I thought I might drive out to that bakery in the next town, I told him casually, referring to my stepson, my hands steady as I poured coffee into a mug. They do those fresh fruit tarts you used to like. He didn't look surprised. He simply said, sure, as though I'd suggested something as ordinary as picking up milk. There was no weight in his tone, but I felt something settle in my chest anyway, something that felt too heavy for such a small decision. My husband wasn't there to hear it. He had left early, another day swallowed by meetings and phone calls and obligations that seemed to expand endlessly. The house felt hollow without him, but not in the way it should have. By late morning, we were in the car. The sky was pale and unremarkable, the kind of weather that doesn't demand attention, and the roads were mostly empty. At first, the drive felt like any other, just two people sharing space, making idle observations about the weather, about the traffic, about the bakery itself. But underneath that thin layer of ordinary words, there was something unspoken pressing against both of us. I caught myself studying him when I shouldn't have, the way his hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, the way he glanced at the rearview mirror even though there was no one behind us. He wasn't talking much, but the silence between us wasn't empty. We reached the cafe just before noon. It was a small place, tucked off the main road, with chipped tables outside and the smell of warm bread spilling out from the door. Inside, the air was heavy with sugar and butter, the kind of sweetness that feels almost tangible. We ordered coffee and 2 slices of tart. We sat at a table by the window, the glass slightly fogged from the heat inside. The conversation was simple at first, about the taste of the tart, about how the bakery had changed since the last time either of us had been there. But as the minutes passed, the pauses between our words stretched, and those pauses seemed louder than anything we said. There was a moment when his hand brushed mine on the table. It wasn't deliberate. Or maybe it was. Neither of us pulled away. And then, in that quiet little cafe, with the clatter of cups and the low hum of strangers' voices around us, we kissed. It happened like the first time, sudden, brief, but unmistakable. A second that felt longer than it should have. When we pulled apart, there was no dramatic reaction, no whispered apologies. Just a quiet return to our seats, the air between us charged but calm. We finished the tart, though I don't remember the taste after that. The drive home was almost entirely silent. Not the strained silence of avoidance, but something different, something more deliberate. Every so often, I caught him looking out the window, his jaw set, his eyes thoughtful. I kept my gaze on the road ahead, my hands clasped too tightly in my lap. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had when we left it, but it felt different now, like something invisible had been rearranged while we were gone. Inside, we moved around each other with care, speaking only when necessary, each of us pretending to focus on small tasks. I put the groceries away. He set his jacket on the chair by the door. Neither of us mentioned the kiss. But as the afternoon stretched on, I felt the weight of it more, not less. When my husband came home later, nothing about the scene gave us away. Dinner was quiet, but dinners had been quiet for a long time. He talked about his day, about the delays at the office. I nodded in all the right places, my smile steady, my voice calm. Across the table, my stepson was the same, calm, composed, almost distant. But when he lifted his glass, when his eyes met mine for just that split second, it felt like a current running through the room, one that only we could feel. That night, lying awake, I thought of the cafe, of the chipped table, the tart, the kiss that had lasted less than a breath. I thought of how something so brief could feel so irreversible. I told myself I could still step back, that I could still fold this into the list of mistakes that never became anything more. But even as I told myself that, I knew I was already past the point of pretending. That evening, the house felt strangely heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. I couldn't explain it any other way, there was no single reason for it, but every room seemed charged, every sound magnified. My husband had stayed late at work, a delay that would normally have been unremarkable. This time, though, his absence felt like an open space we didn't quite know how to fill. I found myself in the garden as the light started to fade. The air was cooler than it had been in weeks, a soft breeze moving the branches, carrying with it the faint smell of cut grass and damp earth. I wasn't sure if I went out there to clear my head or because I knew he'd follow. Maybe both. He joined me after a few minutes, stepping out quietly, his hands in his pockets. He didn't ask why I was there, and I didn't ask why he had come. There was an unspoken understanding in the way we stood there, not facing each other but not far apart either. The conversation was light, almost inconsequential. Something about the weather, about how the garden needed more attention, about the neighbor's new fence. But the tone didn't match the words, it was softer, closer, like we were speaking in a language that no one else could hear. I reached down at one point to pluck a stray weed from the flower bed, and as I straightened, I realized he had stepped closer. Just enough that I felt the warmth of him before I even turned. It wasn't what he said, it was the way he looked at me, steady but unassuming, as though he was asking something without speaking. My breath hitched, not from surprise but from the sheer closeness of it all, the knowledge that what we were doing, standing there, talking about nothing, carried so much more than it should. I heard the sound of the car long before I saw it. My husband's car, pulling into the driveway earlier than either of us had expected. The crunch of tires on gravel, the faint thud of the door closing. He came to the house quietly. I knew his footsteps, I'd known them for years, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the entire balance of the evening shifted. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement at the window. He was there, my husband, standing just inside, half hidden by the curtain. He wasn't saying a word, wasn't calling out, wasn't even making his presence known beyond that stillness. But he was watching. The air felt sharp against my skin. I don't know what my face looked like in that moment. I don't know if I turned too quickly, if my hands moved in some small way that betrayed me. But I felt it, that split-second connection between the inside of the house and where we stood, the way the evening light framed us through the glass. He didn't open the window. He didn't call my name. He didn't ask what we were doing. He just stood there, unmoving, and in that stillness, there was more weight than there would have been in a storm of shouting. My stepson shifted slightly beside me, sensing it too. He didn't speak either. For a long moment, the three of us were suspended like that, him at the window, us in the garden, the air thick with everything that wasn't being said. Eventually, my husband turned away. He disappeared into the house, the curtain falling back into place as if nothing had happened. But it had. The silence after that felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. I stood there for another few seconds, staring at the empty window, before I finally turned and went inside. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, pouring himself a glass of water, his face unreadable. He didn't ask why I'd been in the garden. He didn't mention the window. He simply nodded once, as though the evening was perfectly normal, and carried his glass to the table. We ate dinner later, all three of us, and no one spoke more than necessary. The clink of silverware was louder than it should have been, the scrape of chairs sharper, the sound of my own heartbeat uncomfortably clear. My husband's silence was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of someone who had seen enough to understand, or at least to suspect, but who chose not to voice it. That silence wrapped around me through the night. I lay awake, staring into the dark, feeling the weight of it pressing down. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to break it, or if I was more afraid of what would happen if he did. The next day felt different from the moment I opened my eyes. The house was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that left you aware of every movement, every sound. My husband had already left for work by the time I went downstairs, his car gone from the driveway, his travel mug rinsed and left beside the sink. I moved through the house slowly, almost cautiously. The memory of him at the window the night before wouldn't leave me. That stillness, that silence, it was sharper than any words could have been. I had no idea what he had thought in that moment, whether he had truly seen anything, or if he simply didn't want to see. The morning passed in fragments. I folded laundry. I made a grocery list I didn't really need. I answered an email that could have waited. All the while, I felt an odd awareness of the quiet upstairs, of the presence I could sense even when I didn't hear footsteps or voices. When I finally saw him, my stepson, it was in the hallway. He had just come out of his room, hair slightly damp from a shower, wearing the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. For a second, we simply looked at each other. There was nothing deliberate about it, but the air between us felt heavy. Neither of us said much. A comment about breakfast, a question about errands, words that sounded normal but didn't feel that way. There was something else in the space between them, something that had been growing since the first kiss and had only deepened with each unspoken thing. The day stretched on, and by evening, the house had that same empty quality it always did when my husband stayed late. His text came just after 7, meeting ran over. Don't wait up for me, It should have been a simple message, the kind he sent all the time. But tonight, it felt like the walls shifted when I read it, like the last small barrier had been removed. Later, when the sun had set and the house was lit only by lamps, the quiet felt almost deliberate. There was no plan, no conversation about what would happen. There didn't need to be. We ended up in the living room at first, but it didn't stay there. At some point, I couldn't even tell you when exactly, we were upstairs. And that night, we spent the night together. There's no way to soften the truth of it, no way to make it sound like less than it was. It happened, and the weight of that choice settled over everything immediately. The morning after wasn't like the mornings that had come before. I woke up early, the light barely creeping through the blinds, and for a moment, I didn't move. The house was still, but my mind wasn't. I felt the reality of what had happened settle in my chest, not as a sudden shock, but as something heavier, something I had already known deep down would come. I got up quietly, moving through the hall on bare feet, every creak of the floorboard sounding too loud. I couldn't shake the thought that even if no one else knew, the house itself somehow did. By the time I went downstairs, the routine things, making coffee, setting out breakfast, felt almost surreal. I moved through them automatically, the motions practiced, but nothing about the morning felt ordinary anymore. When I saw him later, neither of us spoke about the night. There were no words for it, not yet. We exchanged the smallest fragments of conversation about coffee, about the day ahead, but beneath those words was the undeniable truth of what we had done. It wasn't guilt I felt most sharply, not at first. It was the awareness that there was no way back. Even if no one ever found out, even if we never spoke of it again, the line had been crossed, and nothing would be the same. That evening, my husband came home on time. He kissed my cheek in that same practiced way, sat at the table, and asked how my day had been. I answered. Calmly. Carefully. The words came out steady, but inside, it felt like I was balancing on something impossibly thin, something that could snap at any second. The house felt different now. It looked the same, but I knew that it wasn't, not anymore, not after last night. The morning after felt like a dream that hadn't quite settled into reality yet. Everything looked the same, the kitchen, the hallway, the sound of the coffee pot gurgling, but I felt like I had stepped into a house that wasn't mine, into a life I no longer recognized. My husband was already downstairs when I walked into the kitchen. He was at the table with his newspaper folded neatly beside his plate, a faint steam rising from his cup of coffee. He glanced up when I entered, his expression calm, maybe too calm, the kind of quiet expression that said more than it hid. He didn't ask about my night. He didn't have to. The kiss on the cheek he gave me felt exactly the same as it always had, the same quick brush, the same routine gesture, but I couldn't unfeel the difference inside myself. Breakfast passed in near silence. A few words here and there, about work, about the errands that needed to be done, about nothing important. But every word felt like it carried weight, every pause felt like it might break under the strain. When my stepson came downstairs, the quiet grew louder. He greeted us the way he always did, calm and polite, but there was something in his eyes when they met mine, not boldness, exactly, but certainty. He wasn't avoiding me, and that almost unnerved me more. My husband barely looked at him, his gaze fixed instead on his cup of coffee. He didn't say much, and that silence was heavier than any direct question could have been. The hours of that day blurred together. I tried to force myself into normality, moving from one task to the next, laundry, dishes, making lists for groceries I didn't need. Each action felt like it should bring back the feeling of routine, of control, but it didn't. Everything I did only made me more aware of how nothing was routine anymore. Every time I caught sight of my stepson, I felt the weight of what we had done the night before. He moved around the house as if nothing had happened, as if the walls hadn't changed, as if the ground beneath our feet wasn't thinner than glass. But I knew he remembered. I could see it in the way he lingered when he passed me in the hallway, in the way his voice softened just slightly when he spoke to me, in the way his gaze stayed a second longer than it needed to. By afternoon, I had run out of small chores to distract myself with. I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring at nothing, trying to think of what to make for dinner. My husband texted around 5 to say he'd be late again. Another meeting. Don't wait up, The message should have been familiar, routine. He'd sent ones like it hundreds of times over the years. But this time it felt different. This time, it felt like there was a gap opening wider by the hour, one I couldn't close. Dinner that night was quiet again. Too quiet. My husband sat at the table across from me, eating methodically, saying almost nothing. The scraping of a fork against a plate sounded like thunder in the stillness. He didn't look angry. He didn't look suspicious. But he didn't look like he used to either. My stepson sat between us, his calm unbroken, though every so often I saw that small flicker in his eyes, a glance, a pause, a question left unasked. After dinner, my husband stayed downstairs for a while, sorting through paperwork, the low hum of the television in the background. My stepson disappeared to his room. The house felt like it was holding its breath. When I finally went to bed, my husband was still downstairs. The sound of the television carried faintly up the stairs, a muted soundtrack to my restless thoughts. Lying in the dark, I realized how impossible the silence had become. Not just between me and him. Not just between me and my stepson. Between all of us. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of questions, of suspicions, of things none of us wanted to name. And I didn't know which would be worse, if that silence lasted forever, or if one of us finally broke it. The days that followed blurred together, each one feeling slightly off-kilter, like a picture frame that had been hung just a little crooked on the wall. Outwardly, life continued in the way it always had, meals prepared, errands run, bills paid, but the current beneath the surface had changed completely. I woke up each morning with the same thought, that what had happened couldn't be undone, that there was no way to slide it neatly into the past and pretend it had never happened. I told myself to act as though nothing had shifted, to hold myself steady, but that resolve cracked a little more every time I heard a familiar step on the stairs or caught a glance that lingered too long. My husband, for his part, behaved as though nothing had changed. Or maybe that was his way of handling it. He moved through his routines with the same quiet efficiency, reading emails before breakfast, watering the plants on the porch, slipping his shoes off by the door. But there was something about his silences now that felt different. They weren't empty silences anymore, they were filled with questions he didn't ask, thoughts he didn't share. My stepson kept his calm, too. He didn't avoid me, and he didn't push, he simply existed in the space we both now knew was entirely different. That almost unnerved me more than if he had been obvious, because his composure made it clear he understood exactly what had happened, exactly what it meant, and that he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even if he never said it aloud. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, the late light spilling across the counter where he leaned. We talked about something harmless, groceries, the weather, but the weight of the night we'd shared was still there, sitting between every word like an invisible object we both had to step around. Later that day, my husband mentioned, almost casually, that he might travel soon for work. Just a few days, he said, his voice neutral, his eyes fixed on something that wasn't me. There's a project they want me on. The words felt like both a relief and a warning. I nodded, trying to keep my face steady, but the thought lodged itself deep. If he left, even for a few days, what would that mean? And what would I do with the emptiness his absence would create? That night at dinner, I caught myself watching him more closely than I should have, searching his face for any sign that he knew more than he was letting on. But there was nothing there, only that same quiet, that same deliberate calm. My stepson barely spoke through the meal, his eyes lowered for most of it. When he did glance up, just once, the look he gave me made my breath catch. When the plates were cleared and the kitchen cleaned, I stood at the sink longer than I needed to, hands submerged in soapy water that had already cooled. The window above the sink reflected my face back at me, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the expression I saw there. The next morning, he told me. Not my husband, my stepson. He walked into the kitchen while I was slicing bread, his voice calm but certain. I'm leaving soon, he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The knife paused in my hand. Not forever, he added. Just. I think I should go back for a while. Figure things out. I nodded slowly, but the words landed like a stone in my chest. It shouldn't have surprised me. From the beginning, there had been an unspoken understanding that his stay was temporary. But hearing it out loud, now, after everything, felt different. I asked when. Soon, he said. In a week, maybe. I nodded again, though my throat felt tight. For the rest of that day, I moved through the house like a shadow. Every familiar task, folding towels, sweeping crumbs from the counter, felt hollow. The thought kept repeating in my head, he was leaving, and I didn't know what that would mean for the pieces of myself that had already shifted, for the life I had before him, for the one I'd been living since he walked back through that door. That evening, my husband came home with flowers. It should have been a kind gesture. In another time, it might have felt like one. But this time, when he handed them to me, it felt like a question, or maybe a warning. The bouquet was bright, cheerful, carefully arranged, but when I thanked him, the word felt strange in my mouth. We ate dinner, the flowers sitting in the middle of the table, their bright colors almost too sharp for the room. My husband spoke about his upcoming trip, about the meetings he would have, and my stepson listened quietly, saying little. When the dishes were cleared, I carried the flowers to the sink to cut the stems and change the water. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged them in the vase. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the week ahead, about what it would mean when he left, about the silence that would come after. I didn't know which was worse, the thought of him staying, or the thought of him going. The morning of his departure arrived with no fanfare, and yet I felt its weight before I even opened my eyes. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you think twice about moving, as though any sound might shatter something fragile hanging in the air. I got up before either of them. The kitchen was still dim, the first light of day barely sliding through the blinds. I put on a pot of coffee, the familiar gurgle echoing louder than usual, and tried to pretend that this was just another day, another ordinary morning. But it wasn't. I moved around the kitchen slowly, touching the edges of counters, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, as if by keeping my hands busy I could keep my mind still. But I couldn't stop the thoughts. Every action was threaded with the knowledge that by the time the sun set, everything would feel different again. I heard his footsteps on the stairs before I saw him. They were unhurried, steady. When he walked into the kitchen, he was carrying a small bag, nothing heavy, nothing that looked like the end of anything. He said, quietly, "Morning." I nodded. Morning. It should have felt ordinary. It didn't. He poured himself coffee, the two of us moving around the kitchen like strangers performing a dance we knew too well, careful not to collide, careful not to say the wrong thing. There was no conversation about last night, or the night before, or any of the nights that had built up to this one. There were no apologies, no reassurances, no desperate words. Just this calm, steady silence that was both unbearable and necessary. My husband came down later. He was dressed neatly, as he always was, his expression unreadable. He greeted us with a simple nod, set his briefcase by the door, and poured his own coffee. Breakfast was a slow, quiet affair. The scrape of a knife on toast, the soft clink of spoons against mugs, every small sound felt amplified. My husband's voice cut through the stillness just once, when he mentioned that he'd be taking a different route to work because of construction. He didn't look at me when he said it. I don't know if he knew. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he had known for weeks and simply chose not to speak it aloud. After breakfast, my stepson zipped his bag and set it by the door. I stood there, watching his movements, every gesture feeling final even though he hadn't said goodbye yet. The drive to the station was short. He had said he didn't need anyone to take him, but in the end, we all got into the car, the three of us, sitting in the same seats we had always sat in, the same road beneath us, but everything about it felt entirely different. My husband drove. His hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. I sat in the passenger seat, my stepson behind me, the silence in the car almost physical, like something you could reach out and touch. We arrived at the station early. The lot was mostly empty, the sky low and gray. He stepped out of the car first, pulling his bag with him, and for a moment, the three of us stood there, awkwardly suspended. He looked at me. Just for a second, but it was enough. There was no smile, no lingering glance meant to say more than it should. Just that look, one that carried every moment we'd shared and everything that would remain unspoken. My husband placed a hand on his shoulder and said something practical, about the train schedule, about calling when he arrived. His voice was calm, even, the same voice he used for everything. I stayed quiet. When the train pulled in, the sound was louder than it needed to be, steel grinding against steel, the hiss of brakes breaking through the air. He boarded with no hesitation, his bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look back, not really. And then he was gone. The drive home was quiet. My husband didn't speak, and I didn't either. When we got back to the house, he carried his briefcase to his study, setting it down with a soft thud. I stood in the kitchen, my hands resting on the counter, staring at the vase of flowers he'd bought days ago. They were still bright, but the edges of the petals had begun to curl. He came into the kitchen after a while. He didn't say much, just stood there for a moment, then placed his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a question. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply a gesture. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things he wouldn't say, of things I couldn't, of choices that had already been made and couldn't be undone. And as I stood there, staring at the flowers, feeling the weight of his hand, I realized that there wouldn't be a neat ending, no clear conclusion. There would just be this house, this silence, this life we would continue to live. And the knowledge that even when things look the same, they never really are again.